indeed. Thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. It's a particular pleasure to do it as a tribute to Professor Nissa Siddiqui. He was a remarkable academic, individual, researcher, and policymaker, and his contribution to education in Sukkur University are legendary. I was particularly pleased to see the pictures of his birthday celebration recently in the SOS Children Village at Jamshoro. SOS Children Village is a charity that my wife and I have supported for about 30 years. So it was a great pleasure to see that association as well. Business is one of the most important institutions in our lives. It clothes, feeds, and houses us. It employs us, and it invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity and the growth of nations around the world. At the same time, it's been a source of growing environmental degradation, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. But business is also going through one of its most profound changes, the sort of change that occurs in business perhaps every 60 or so years. And the reason for that change is in part motivated by these challenges that business is currently facing. And underpinning that is the notion of why business exists, why it's created, its reason for being, namely the purpose of business. The notion of the purpose of business is something that has been discussed for a very long period of time. And it came to a fore in the 1960s when Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said that there is one and only one social purpose of business: to increase profit so long as it stays within the rules of the game. And that's been the basis of business education, business policy, and business practice ever since. But it hasn't always been the case. Indeed, business was established some 2,000 years ago under Roman law as the Societas Publicanorum to undertake very public functions of collecting taxes, minting coins, and maintaining public buildings. And for nearly all of its 2,000-year history, it has combined a public role with a commercial one. It's particularly over the last 60 years that this notion that there is one and only one purpose of business, to make money, has arisen. And that has been a source of many of the issues and problems that we're currently encountering. But that is changing. And so, for example, Larry Fink, the CEO and president of BlackRock, the largest investment management business in the world, has said that every business needs to have a purpose, not a strapline or a marketing campaign, but a statement of its fundamental reason for being, what it does on a daily basis. Purpose, he said, is not the sole pursuit of profits, but the animating force for achieving them. And we've had statements by the Business Roundtable about purpose of business as being about delivering value to customers, investing in employees, supporting suppliers, caring for communities, and delivering long-term value for their shareholders. Now, these notions of purpose and how purpose extends beyond just the Milton Friedman doctrine of the only purpose of business being to increase profits are something that is something that's really beginning to galvanize business in terms of the way in which it's looking at its activities and its reason for being. And in particular, the notion that's beginning to emerge in terms of why business exists is in terms of seeing it as being there to help us as individuals, communities, societies, and the natural world, to help us to solve the problems that we face as individuals, societies and the natural world. And in particular, to do it in a form that is commercially viable and profitable. And that is the real challenge that business faces. It's not philanthropy, it's not charity. It's there to generate profit and to be sustainable in terms of its funding ability as a result of generating profit. So the way in which I and a program that I've been leading at the British Academy in the UK, the British Academy is the UK's National Academy of the Humanities and Social Sciences, the way in which that program has argued about the notion of corporate purpose is to say it's about producing profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either. So it's about producing profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet, and also not profiting from producing problems for either. Now that both of those components are very important, and they emphasize that the notion of a corporate purpose is not about marketing or promoting the business or making it look good. It's about its core activities, about what its strategy should be. It's not, as I've said, about philanthropy or indeed about corporate social responsibility, something that's done on the side. It is core to its activities. And this notion of a purpose as being about solving problems is not vague or woolly. It's a precise about what problems a business should be solving, whose problems, how it's going to solve those problems, when it's solving those problems, and why that business is particularly well suited to addressing those problems. Now, I want to illustrate this in relation to a particular company, which is a Danish company. It's a pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk, which produces insulin. Insulin is used in the treatment of type 2 as well as type 1 diabetes. And Novo Nordisk used to state that its purpose was simply to produce insulin. Now, that's not really a statement of a purpose in the way in which I've just described it in terms of solving problems. That's just a statement of what the business does. So it began to reflect more carefully about its purpose, and it concluded that its purpose was to help people treat type 2 diabetes. And the importance of recognizing that is that some 80% of type 2 diabetes is found in low and middle income countries, many of which could not afford to purchase its insulin products, at least at the scale that was necessary. So it began to think further about alternative ways of treating type 2 diabetes, which might involve taking insulin, but didn't necessarily do so. And so it started working with hospitals, doctors, and universities around the world to identify the best ways of treating type 2 diabetes. And then it realized that actually its purpose was even more than helping people to treat type 2 diabetes. It was to help them avoid getting type 2 diabetes at all. And so it started working with governments, local authorities, health workers to identify changes in lifestyles that might help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes at all. And you might say, well, that's all very well worthy and worthwhile, but doesn't it undermine the fundamental business model of Novo Nordisk? And the answer is no. What Novo Nordisk encountered was that its business flourished on the back of this. It flourished basically because in the process of building those relationships with hospitals, doctors, universities, governments, local health authorities, etc., it built relations of trust with those organizations, by which it became a trusted provider of products and advice. And its business boomed as a consequence of that. Now, I think that that brings out two important elements. The first is in terms of the importance of bringing clarity to what a real purpose of solving problems in a profitable fashion means. And the second is that if one can bring that clarity to a company's purpose and a commitment to a delivery of it, then that creates one of the most valuable assets that a company can have. And that is to be trusted by its customers, by its communities, by its employees, by its suppliers, etc. And thereby to be recognized as being trustworthy from their perspective. Now, one of the issues that arises then in terms of thinking about this notion of business as being not just there to generate profits, but to do so as a product of a mechanism of solving problems of other parties. So it's really an other regarding rather than just a self-regarding view of what a purpose of a business is. And in the process, recognizing that profits are not the fundamental purpose. They're very important, but they are derivative of the purpose of solving problems. Now, the question that that raises is, well, how can companies effectively do that, and how in particular can they commit to the delivery of those purposes? And we've been working in Oxford and in conjunction with many other institutions around the world in terms of helping boards of companies, boards of some of the largest companies throughout the world, in terms of how they can define and embed purposes in their business. And we've developed a framework to assist them, which we've called the SCORE framework, where the 5 letters of the word SCORE are an acronym for what we emphasize as being the core components. So the first letter, S, is for simplify, to simplify the corporate purpose in a way in which I was just describing, that Novo Nordisk went through that journey of recognizing what its real purpose was and to bring simplicity to the notion of its corporate purpose, which it now describes as being to defeat diabetes. The second letter, C, is about connecting that purpose with a company's strategy, and also connecting it with the other parties that are needed to assist the company in delivering on its purpose. So in the example of Novo Nordisk, the connections it made with hospitals, doctors, universities, etc., all of which were essential in terms of it identifying the best forms of treatment, or in the case of governments and local health authorities, with identifying changes in lifestyles that varied depending on the countries in which it was operating. The third letter, O, is about ownership, about owning the corporate purpose, which in part relates to the formal ownership of the company, namely the shareholders of the firm. And in the case of Novo Nordisk, its ownership is very important. It's listed on the Danish and New York stock markets and actively traded, but it also has a dominant shareholder, which is the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is essentially a trust. And that's the largest shareholder that has a controlling shareholding of the voting rights in Novo Nordisk. Now, the importance of that is it gives stability to the company in terms of being able to pursue its corporate purpose. But ownership is not just about the formal ownership, but also about the ownership of the purpose in the organization. And a key element in terms of the success of that is to ensure that it's embedded throughout the organization, from the board down to the shop floor. And that in particular, the values and the culture of the organization are aligned with the delivery of that purpose, so that everyone in the organization recognizes what their contribution to the delivery of the corporate purpose should be. The fourth letter, R, is about reward, about the formal reward and incentive mechanism in the organization alongside the culture and the values. And that relates to questions about how the performance of a company is measured in relation to the fulfillment of its purpose. So one of the implications of this notion of the purpose of a business is that one needs to be able to measure the performance in terms of the success in solving those problems and creating the metrics and measures about outcomes and impacts, as well as the inputs and the outputs that the company produces. And then to relate the reward system in terms of incentives and promotion in the organization to those measures of the success in terms of solving problems. And the final letter is about exemplifying, bringing that purpose to life through the use of narratives that describe how the company is promoting its purpose, how it's succeeding in terms of addressing problems, and the challenges and difficulties that it faces in terms of doing this. Because a critical element in terms of building up those relations of trust is in terms of being seen to be authentic, being true to the purpose, and recognizing failures as well as successes in the process. Now, there are many areas that have increasingly adopted this notion of a corporate purpose and are seeking to, in one way or another, implement and embed it in their businesses. So to give one example, which is much discussed at present in relation to the oil and gas industries, the fossil fuel companies, they're increasingly recognizing that they are not oil and gas or fossil fuel companies, they are energy companies. And that energy companies are there to help solve the world's energy problems, which of course is in large part linked into a shift from fossil fuels to renewables. But it's more than that. It's also about ensuring that in the process of making that transition, that energy doesn't not then become inaccessible or unaffordable to people in different parts of the world, particularly in low income countries. And so it has to be thought about in terms of not just the energy transition, but what is termed a just energy transition, by which people mean that it has to be a transition to renewables that, if anything, enhances the degree of accessibility and affordability of energy around the world. And this, I think, illustrates the significance of really bringing a clarity to the notion of what a purpose of a company is, and how that then has to be the overarching framework within which a company determines its strategy and then seeks to ensure that that strategy is reflected throughout the organization in terms of how people view their role, in this case, in terms of not just promoting a shift to renewable sources of energy, but also in terms of being clear about the problems that different parts of the world face in terms of being sources of the fuels that energy companies are using, and also in terms of the problems that people face in terms of gaining access and purchasing energy in an affordable form. Now, one of the important elements that comes out from this is that the notion of purpose that's being talked about here is not an issue around trading off the performance of companies against providing solutions to the problems of the world. And in particular, it is not a stakeholder versus a shareholder view of the firm. That notion, which has been very much at the fore of discussions over the last few decades in terms of the emphasis that should be placed on stakeholder interest against shareholder interest, suggests that there is a conflict between the two. And that in particular, many people say that in the process of promoting stakeholder interest, what one is doing is one's complicating and confusing the nature of the running of businesses, complicating the way in which management can operate in terms of delivering what previously has been a very straightforward objective of simply increasing financial returns for shareholders. And the answer to that is that that is not what is being put forward here. That notion of profitably solving the problems of people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either, deliberately has those two parts to it. Because in saying that companies should not profit from producing problems for people or planet, what is being said is that companies need to remedy, rectify, mitigate, and compensate for the problems that they're producing for others, so that the notion of a profit is one that is then aligned with the delivery of benefits for other parties in the world. In other words, it's saying that a profit is earned, a legitimate profit is earned against the true cost of a business, not just the cost of producing its products, but the true cost associated with remedying and rectifying detriments that it causes, in which case a profit is then directly aligned with problem solving, not problem creation. And therefore, one doesn't have to look to this as being an empirical issue as to whether or not there is a positive relationship between financial performance and the solution of problems without causing problems. It becomes a definitional notion of what a profit is. A profit is earned where a company creates benefit, not problems for others. Now, I've emphasized the significance of this in relation to the environmental crisis and energy companies. Coronavirus brought this out very clearly as well, in the following sense, that what crises of the financial crisis form, the environmental crisis, the pandemic do is to not only destroy a lot of economic value, but also to create a lot of problems, a lot of new problems for business as well as for other parties. But if one thinks about business as being there to solve problems, not a source of problems, then in terms of solving those problems, what businesses are doing is to identify new ways of solving those problems. And when crises create problems for the world, as coronavirus clearly has done in spades, then that is creating new opportunities for business to solve those problems, to find ways of solving those problems in commercially viable forms. And that is precisely what the most successful companies in the pandemic did. So when they found that the restaurants and shops and theaters and whatever were closed as a consequence of the pandemic, the successful firms were ones that recognized that this actually provides opportunities of finding new ways of running their businesses and providing the types of solutions that people and communities needed as a result of the pandemic. And it's not only a matter of companies identifying those innovative solutions, it's ways of finding methods of partnering with other organizations, with other businesses, but also with the public sector as well as the private sector. Because in many cases, these problems cannot be solved by business on their own. Although energy companies can do a great deal in terms of transition to renewable sources, when it comes to this notion of accessibility and affordability, they have to partner with the public sector in terms of doing that. And similarly, in the pandemic, the most successful companies were ones that partnered in a productive way with the public sector. Now, one of the great advantages of this notion of the purpose of business as being to produce profitable solutions is that it aligns the interests between business and the public sector. Previously, when business was just concerned with maximizing profits, that gave rise to a great deal of conflict between business and government, because business saw itself as making money, the public sector as promoting the public interest. And that gave rise to a divergence of interest between the two, and many attempts at partnership, for example, public-private partnerships and private finance initiatives, were a disappointing failure. Through shifting this notion of what a purpose is, then one begins to recognize the potential for creating really productive relationships between business and government going forward. So what this notion of purpose really is about is imagining a new future, a narrative around which people can coalesce, that people find inspiring, motivational, and fulfilling, giving real meaning to work and employment, not least in terms of the potential for entrepreneurship and starting new companies, and recognizing that in the process of creating a company, one has to have a clear notion of what that purpose is. Because if one hasn't, when one's founding a company, then the company will never have the basis for doing that and will not have the fundamental component that is critical to the commercial success of a business. What everyone working for a business wants to feel is a sense of pride and dignity, not shame or blame for the work that they're doing. And in the process, what this purpose of a business does is to create, as I said, its most valuable asset, and that is the trust in and of the company. Because trusted corporations are commercially successful corporations. And the